Welcome to video number 7. In this one, we're going to look at 3 more principles beginning with empowerment. We've talked about it a little bit earlier. Empowerment is really about facilitating the autonomy and authority of the supported person. So autonomy, once again, means authority over ourselves. For example, the right to decide what happens with our body, or what happens if we're planning our school career, for example. And authority is the power we have over others. We are pretty much entitled to autonomy in almost all circumstances, unless, for example, we end up in prison. But authority is something that is legitimate in some contexts, but not in others. For example, as a parent, you start off having a lot of authority over your children, but as they get older and older and older, your authority diminishes, and you hope that they will be more autonomous and fill in the gaps. There are lots of examples where as adults we have legitimate authority and we tend to really value it, whether we're a coach of a local baseball team or whether it's having a job with certain responsibilities like being the manager or having the right to lock up at the end of the day. So we really value the opportunity to have authority, and when we don't have it, we tend to go and look for it in a way that's not as legitimate. We start getting bossy or controlling of other people, for example. So we want to help people to find authority in ways that are socially acceptable but meaningful to them as well. So there are 3 ingredients when we're doing this. The first is to help people develop the skills they need. The second is to have plenty of opportunities to use these skills so that they can practice them and get better and get more comfortable. But the third is something I might call restoration, or giving people back the authority that they should normally have had. Sometimes people never knew they had that authority in the first place, or autonomy. So it can be about informing and encouraging people. Empowerment is not about giving just meaningless decisions to people. It's about helping them to have as much control over their lives as possible, and every day trying to increase as much of that as possible. So empowerment is a gradual process, and we give people meaningful decisions, or juicy decisions, as one of my colleagues likes to call them. And then when those decisions are made, it's up to us to honor them. It's not just supposed to be lip service, or we're not just supposed to act like we're actually doing it. We really are supposed to do it. We're also supposed to apply the principle of collaboration and consultation, which simply means that we work with others who care for and about the client. That can mean stakeholders that are paid, like other program staff, or it can also mean people who are family and friends of that individual, people that that person has chosen to have in their life. The aim here is for us to try and include those people because we share common ground, and often those people know things about that person or have a more genuine motivation and a more sustained connection to that person than paid people do. When we are paternalistic or think that we're better than those folks, we forget something. Often we are gone a year or 2 or 3 later in that person's life, yet their personal stakeholders are still there, and they have been there before we got there as well. So respecting what those people have to tell us is incredibly important. And I'll be honest in telling you that sometimes people have had such unpleasant experiences with professionals that they're not necessarily really easy to listen to or easy to work with. But that doesn't matter. We're not supposed to only do it when it feels good. It's supposed to be done when it's the best thing for the supported person. We want to approach people's input with respect and value. And again, we're not trying to give people lip service. We need to be good at understanding what's critical and what isn't critical, and we need to concede. That's what concession means. Give up the things that don't really matter. Just because it's done a certain way or because it's been done a certain way in the past isn't a good enough justification for doing something that is contrary to the wishes of people within that circle of support. And one more thing, understand that collaboration and consultation is not the same thing as simply saying yes to people. Sometimes there's a process of negotiating or of facilitating a conversation so that you agree to some degree of common ground. And in some cases, we might have to live with degrees of disagreement. For example, we might say to somebody that we are not going to allow them to smoke marijuana in a group home, that even though they live in the group home, they can't smoke it in the home. If they go to their friends' houses or their parents' home on the weekend and they're allowed to do it there, then that's a different thing. We might agree to disagree, but find a way for that to work. And that can be one of the products of this collaborative and consultative process. So I want you to take a moment before we get into the third one in this slide and consider how you might act in order to fulfill those two principles. What might you actively do to create more empowerment in the life of a person? And what might you actively do to improve the amount of collaboration and consultation that you do? In this case, the answers are going to be in the same video, so pause, reflect on these things, and start the video again. Let's see how you did. With empowerment, there are many, many things we can do. For example, teaching people life skills and social skills. And this includes things like financial skills and sociosexual skills, because there's so many opportunities for power to be gained or lost if we don't possess those skills. Informing people of their rights, and this is something we'll probably have to do in many, many cases. There'll be a degree of repetition and of simplifying and strategy. And we'll have to help people navigate complex processes, such as the process for applying for things on a government website can be very complex for people. Giving people opportunity to express choices in the community. Just lots of rehearsal opportunities, for example, filling their own shopping cart or choosing food off a menu. Helping people to have an income. Money is a really big source of power, or how to save money when they do have an income. Giving people tools and equipment, especially those that create access, whether it's a wheelchair that allows a person to get out, or a cellular phone that allows them to make calls with voice commands. Helping people to develop language skills or augmentative communication if they don't have language skills. Getting people keys to their own homes or spaces, or maybe keys that only they possess. Informing people of their schedules or finances so that they know what they have and they can therefore make decisions. Involving people in hiring or administrative decisions. I think this is a very progressive thing that I've seen some agencies do, where the supported person participates in the interview or the reference check or the orientation. Giving people the opportunity to help with menu planning and cooking, such a fundamental part of our lives that we really are picky about, most of us, and yet we often don't ask the people we support what they want to eat or have them be in control of what it looks like as it's getting cooked. Helping people to vote in elections. Helping people to have opportunities for leadership, community engagement, or mentoring. So something as simple as giving a person a chance to be a volunteer or to run for a board can be a big difference. Offering meeting and resolution discussions. So for example, when we have people living in a home, one of the things we can do is simply have gatherings that have the intention of working out differences. That's a way of helping people to have their choices respected, and helping people to have mediation through your skills or teaching them those skills is valuable. Doing customer feedback surveys for people. Sometimes these should even be anonymous so you know you're getting good information. And giving people an opportunity at regular check-ins where you actually say to them, how are you feeling about this? Or what would you like to see us do differently? And you probably thought of some others that we can talk about in our information or in our discussions. When it comes to collaboration and consultation, some of the same tools are useful. For example, most recently we talked about involving all of the stakeholders around the table for annual planning meetings. We also talked about doing that when we're doing care planning or when we're planning personal care protocols. And that might not be something that just happens once a year. It's really a better practice if it happens more often than that. Another cool thing I've seen is for agencies to encourage family members to become involved as directors or members of the board, sometimes called governors, within those organizations. Now they have a real say. Intentionally going about program planning in collaboration with other agencies is a very progressive practice. So if I run a day program and another agency runs the group home, I want to see if we can at least work into some degree collaboration so that we're not going to confuse and frustrate the supported person, so that what we're doing makes as much sense as possible. Facilitators, surveys, and collaborative documents can all be valuable tools as well. Facilitators are people who would just make sure that in a conversation everybody's getting heard. So they might bring people together during planning sessions or town hall meetings or conversations that were meant to mediate specific disagreements. Surveys and collaborative documents are also valuable, getting people to give their input. And many of you used a tool like this with Google Docs in a recent project. You can easily do that with people to get their input as well. And Routine, formal, and informal check-ins. Having somebody who's in decision-making capacity phone a family or sit down and have a coffee with a supported person are really simple ways for us to make sure that we're finding out from people what they care about. And of course, we should be looking at the data that other people have collected when they've done the same thing. Okay, again, you may have come up with others there, and I hope that you did. The last principle I want us to explore in this video is called the avoidance of conflict of interest. It's a very particular ethic, and it's one that a lot of people struggle with, so please pay close attention. Many people have heard this term, conflict of interest, in the past, but it is not well understood, and in fact, I notice people frequently using it incorrectly. A conflict of interest occurs when a staff person has two potential ways of gaining, and in one of those two ways, there's a possibility that harm may come to the supported person. Let's explain using an example. If I go to a grocery store with one of my clients to do some grocery shopping, we both have an interest. My client has an interest in getting groceries, and I have an interest in getting a paycheck. It's all good because both of us are getting our interests met. The more that I help him to grocery shop, the better off he will be and the better off I will be. Our interests are aligned. They aren't in conflict. But what would happen if I owned that grocery store? Now when I go to the grocery store with my client, I'm not only going to get paid by helping them to shop for groceries, but the more of my groceries they purchase, the more I'm going to get paid as the grocery store owner. I have two ways of gaining, and one of them is potentially going to harm my client. Because if I convince my client to buy more groceries than they should, or if I overcharge my client, or I sell my client groceries that are not as good a quality, then I am gaining because he is losing. And that's a conflict of interest. Now let's take a look at a third scenario. What if I don't work with that client? All I do is own a grocery store. And that client comes to my grocery store and purchases groceries. Once again, our interests are aligned. The client gets the groceries, I get my money. You'll notice that in scenario 1 and scenario 3, I was only gaining in one way. In the first instance, I gained as a CSW, and in the third instance, I gained as a grocery store owner. In the middle one, the one that was the problem, I had two different interests. I was a CSW and a grocery store owner, and that's where the problem lies. So it's really important for us to know what to do when we come across scenarios like this, and it starts with recognizing them. Once we recognize them, our choices are pretty simple. We have to do one of two things. The most basic is simply not do it. In the scenario I was talking about before, it would be smart for me to simply take my client to another grocery store and completely remove any question about whether or not I was shopping in my own venue as a way of getting some extra payment out of the situation. But what if I own the only grocery store in town, or I sell the only product there that this individual really wants? Well, there's a second option. I can go to somebody who is not involved and who has authority. That person who's not involved is said to be at arm's length because they're not involved. And that authority means that they have the ability to tell me no. They can say yes or no. Somebody like Mr. Perry would be an example in the school. And so if I go to that person and I declare what this conflict is, and they still say yes, then we're okay. But if they say no, then I still have to go with no. And the more common option is the first one. But sometimes people do declare and are able to go ahead and work openly so that everybody is aware and can be paying attention in case something untoward looks like it happened. Now, one of the most common things people say to me is, well, isn't that the same as theft? And the answer is no, because in theft, there's no legitimate alignment of gain. So let's go to a fourth scenario. I'm going to go grocery shopping with my client, but this time, instead of being a CSW, I'm going to go there with the intention of stealing, whether it's from the client or the grocery store, by the way, doesn't matter. There's no legitimacy in my motivation by any standard anywhere. I shouldn't do it. I'm not doing something that's advancing my client's welfare or the grocery store's welfare. It's only going to help me. So a theft is not going to be legitimized by some kind of declaration. I can't go to my boss and say I'm planning on stealing from a client and have them make it okay. So in the case of a theft, I simply don't do it. Theft or dishonesty is not the same as conflict of interest. Let's look at it in further detail. A conflict of interest occurs then when there are two or more conflicting interests. In other words, the staff person has two ways that they're motivated to gain. But remember, gain is not always defined in financial terms. So for example, let's say that I stand to gain by having my wife hired by the same agency, or by getting a powerful position, even if it doesn't pay more money, or more fame, for example. All of those things might be ways that I'm gaining. Now, there's lots of legitimacy. You can go out and get fame or power or help your wife get a job and not do something immoral or unethical. But it's when you do it potentially in conflict with another one of your motivations, another one of your responsibilities, your gains, that you are in conflict. So if I help my wife to get a job at a certain agency, but I don't work there, I'm good. If I work for that agency and I help her get that job there, I am potentially at a risk of conflict of interest. What can I do? I can either declare it or tell my wife, don't apply where I work. So you'll notice that in those circumstances, either of the motivations on their own would have been fine. It's when they come together that we have a conflict. To act without either of the solutions below would therefore raise a question of trust and confidence by the people we serve, by our coworkers, and by the community as a whole. And that's the whole idea of conflict of interest, is it creates a feeling of distrust. Even if you're not acting dishonorably, even if at the end of the day that grocery store owner sells his groceries at a very reasonable price to that supported individual, unless there is this openness, there's going to be questions of conflict. So again, the way we solve it is to declare to a higher arm's length authority and let them decide, or to simply recuse ourselves, meaning don't get engaged in the conflict. Don't do it. So let's take a look at 4 scenarios and see if you can see which principles apply in each of these. I'll tell you one hint in that they're all different. In scenario 1, Sam submitted a receipt for 12 cans of pop, but he kept 6 of them for himself. In scenario 2, Donald reported that he was working on shift, but he was actually watching the hockey game and eating popcorn. In scenario 3, Elliot sold life insurance to his client without anybody else knowing. And in scenario 4, Lyle lost a $400 tablet during an outing, but he was open about it with his supervisor and coworkers. Take a moment and see if you can identify which principles apply in those 4 cases. And I'm looking specifically for what I might describe as the most obvious principles. You don't need to go into great detail, but see if you can find the one that might have conflict of interest, or more than one if you think that's here, and other principles that are closely related. Let's see how you did. In the case of Sam, Sam was violating the principle of honesty and integrity. How come? Well, he lied and he deceived. He pretended that he had done something which is called fraud, and then he used that fraud to cover up the fact that he was getting something he was not entitled to. It is not conflict of interest. Again, there's no legitimate way that he could have taken 6 cans of pop. There was no way he could have declared himself out of this. Donald reported that he was working on shift, but he was actually watching the game. Well, in that case, once again, he's stealing. He's not stealing money or stealing pop. In this case, he's stealing time. He's not supposed to go there and waste things, including his own time. And further, he's also violating the principle of accountability, because if you look carefully, you can see that it says he reported something. And what he reported was not true. So he's been dishonest and he's had false records. He's covered something up that he didn't do, that he should have done and he didn't do. So he's violated 2 principles. Now, what about Elliot? Elliot sold life insurance to his client without anybody else knowing, and that's a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest happens because Elliot didn't tell anybody or recuse himself. Maybe his client needed life insurance. Maybe there's some legitimacy to this interaction, But Elliot cannot be the one who decides this because he has two ways of gaining. He gains because he's a CSW to his client, helping to empower him, but he also gains because he's the person getting the profit from the life insurance policy. If Elliot was really smart, he would have simply offered to take his client to buy life insurance from somebody else. All right, if Elliot felt he was the best deal in town or the only game in town, he would have gone to somebody at arm's length who could say yes or no to that decision. And finally, let's talk about Lyle. Lyle didn't do anything unethical. He might have been dopey or careless, but we don't have enough evidence to suggest that he did something that was unethical. And he did the one thing he needed to do, which was be open about it. He was accountable, so he's violated no principles. If we had evidence that Lyle stole it or that Lyle was careless about it, then we might have some other step we could take. But just because a mistake was made doesn't mean that unethical conduct occurred. Sometimes mistakes occur and have no consequences. Sometimes they occur and have intense consequences. It's not whether the consequence is intense or small that determines if something is unethical. It's whether or not we can identify a principle, or more than one principle in some cases, as having been violated.